Well, it's been 11 weeks since the US and Israel launched the war in Iran, and negotiations to end the conflict reached a deadlock. Both Washington and Tehran have rejected the terms on a potential peace deal, with threats of resuming war. Now, President Donald Trump slammed Tehran's latest proposal, warning that the fragile ceasefire is on life support.
After reading that piece of garbage they sent us, I didn't even finish reading it. They said, I'm not going to waste my time reading it. I would say it's one of the weakest right now. It's on life support. They understand these are all medical people. Dr. Oz, life support is not a good thing. Do you agree?
Bad prognostic.
I would say the ceasefire is on massive life support, where the doctor walks in and says, sir, your loved one has approximately a 1% chance of living. But the plan is they cannot have a nuclear weapon. And they didn't say that in their letter.
Iran's parliamentary speaker is a leading member of the negotiating team. Now, he says the armed forces are ready to respond to any US aggression. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf says Washington has, quote, no alternative but to accept the rights of the Iranian people as laid out in Tehran's 14-point proposal. Discuss this further with our guest. Joining us from Tehran too is Fouad Izadi. He's associate professor at the University of Tehran. Joining us from Turin in Italy is Lorenzo Kamel, professor of international history at the University of Turin. Good to have you both with us. So let me start, if I may, with Fouad in Iran. So where does the intense exchange of words that we've had in the last, 24, 48 hours between the two sides, where does that leave the mediation effort? Is there still room for the process of exchanging proposals to go on?
I think both sides would like to avoid another serious war. So you should be hopeful with regard to reaching some sort of a settlement. The problem that Trump has is that he doesn't want to get something similar to what Obama got in 2015. And that is going to be difficult because the things that he is asking Iran to do, it's difficult for Iranians to provide. One of the rhetoric that Trump has used in the last number of days is threatening indirectly to attack Iran with nuclear weapons when he talks about destroying Iranian civilization, returning Iran to the Stone Age, seeing big glows in Iran. In Iran, at least, people think that he is referring to attacking Iran with nuclear weapons. And one reason he hasn't done that, a lot of people here believe, is because of that enriched uranium in the country. Because if Trump attacks Iran with nuclear weapons or threatens to attack Iran with nuclear weapons, then that would give permission to Iran to do something with that enriched uranium. Everybody in the world would accept the fact that when a country is attacked with nuclear weapons, they may do something in response in a more serious manner. And this type of rhetoric is not helping the negotiations.
All right, let me bring in Lorenzo Kamel. Is the US president basically stuck in a series of no good options facing him? Continuing the airstrikes or the strikes on Iran, according to a leaked report, CIA report published in US media, talked about skepticism, or at least the CIA having some questions about whether a return to conflict would produce anything more effective for the US. And he, on the other hand, can't seem to get Iran to give him the sort of concessions that he wants that would allow him a deal that he could claim is better than the Obama-era deal.
Yes, first of all, let's stress that at the moment, Trump needs greater freedom of action in managing the World Cup of football, the midterm elections in the US. So in this sense, these are major somehow priorities for him. So he is looking for kind of a temporary truce, but some of the elements that are there is that somehow the last part of the Trump administration is likely to coincide with a showdown with an increasingly uncertain outcome. Also because somehow a cornered US, of course, with an Iran that is gaining much out of what on the dynamics on Hormuz and elsewhere. So once again, from the perspective of the US, this is a major problem, if not in the long term, also an existential threat for the way in which the US are managing a large part of the world. Then about China, because you were mentioning also China, so I want just to stress, and like what was mentioned before, that in the sense China and Iran, they have millenary relations, and we see that, of course, China was not involved in this region, and this, from the perspective of many or millions of people in the region, military speaking, of course, I'm referring, so from the perspective of millions of people in the region, this makes a huge difference.
On that point of China, Fouad Izadi in Tehran, one of the ways the US seems to be pursuing the idea of trying to put more pressure on Iran is further sanctions on those entities it sees as involved in not only the sale but also the shipping of oil to Iran. How much impact is that likely to have on Iran's ability to get oil out?
It's going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy. As you know, we are under blockade for the last month or so. But the Chinese government did something a few days ago that they have never done before. When the new round of sanctions were announced against Chinese companies, the Chinese government issued an official instruction prohibiting companies for following that dictate that came from Washington. They call it blocking measures, which means that they are trying to block the success of U.S. sanctions by threatening companies that follow those directions that they will have to pay a penalty or a price for listening to the United States. So these companies have a choice whether they should be listening to U.S. or listening to China, and the Chinese government is telling them that don't listen to the United States, and they have never done that before. This was the first time that they did it. So it seems, at least with that data, that the Chinese government is doubling down on its policy towards Iran. They realize that if Trump and Netanyahu are able to take over Middle Eastern oil, they will use that to put pressure on China. They will use that as a leverage that they don't have right now. And they don't have to rely on analysis here. Lindsey Graham, a few days after the start of the war, said that once U.S. is done, they will make a lot of money out of Iranian oil and they will have leverage against China. So I think Chinese government officials understand these things.
So, Lorenzo, in Turin, does listening to what Fouad is saying there, of course, the Chinese government is telling its companies to ignore the US measures. Will the Chinese companies and entities do that? Will they be able to do that if other intermediaries in the process may also be sanctioned?
Yes, let's first of all put a bit of history at the center stage. There are thousands of history of ties that exist between China and Persia and Iran, as well with the rest of the region. It's enough here to mention that when the Sassanid Empire fell in the 7th century, the Persian royal family was welcome in China. And also there is also a hadith in the Quran that says that seek knowledge even if it's in China. So once again, these are really layered historical elements. And this millenary connection does not somehow erase physiological prudence, which I would not call distrust. It's clear that China, somehow like other countries in Asia, is increasingly frustrated with having to bear the economic costs of a war that was launched by the US and Israel. Conversely, China has never been involved, as I was mentioned before, in this region and continues to absorb, let's say, about 90% of Iranian oil export. So in this sense, Iran has leverages control over the Strait of Hormuz to impose transit fees in Chinese yuan and also in cryptocurrency and currency. So in this sense, it's a way of bypassing the US dollar, and it is a real-time test for the petrodollar system. So I believe the short answer to your question that yes, the companies in China will comply with that because they are aware, of course, that also the balance of power are changing, and of course these historical layers that I was mentioning also play a role.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Let's thank both of our guests, Fouad Izadi, Associate Professor of the University of Tehran, joining us from the Iranian capital, and Lorenzo Kamel, Professor of International Relations at the University of Turin in Italy. Thank you both.